Welcome. I'm Jeff Resnick. I'm Chief of the History of Medicine Division here at the National Library of Medicine at the National Institutes of Health. Thank you very much for joining us today for our History of Medicine talk, which is in fact the last of this calendar year. This annual series of programs is designed to promote awareness and use of NLM and related historical collections for research, education, and public service in the fields of biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. NLM History Talks also support the commitment of the National Library of Medicine to recognize the diversity of its collections, which span 10 centuries, encompass a range of digital and physical formats, and originate from nearly every part of the globe. Moreover, NLM History Talks foreground the voices of people of color, women, and individuals of a variety of cultural and disciplinary backgrounds who value these collections and use them to advance their research, teaching, and learning. For those of you who wish to share questions with our speaker this afternoon, please use the live feedback button that you see under the video. Use this feature to send your questions at any point during today's presentation. Today, I have the great pleasure and privilege of introducing Dr. Melissa Reynolds, Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in the Wolf Humanities Center at the University of Pennsylvania and lecturer in History and Sociology of Science, also at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Reynolds is a historian of early modern European medicine and science. She received her PhD in history from Rutgers in 2019 and was the Perkins-Cottson Postdoctoral Fellow in the Society of Fellows at Princeton University from 2019 to 2022. Her first book, entitled Reading Practice, The Pursuit of Knowledge from Manuscript to Print, forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press, tells the story of how 15th and 16th century readers and writers learned to embrace roles as purveyors and adjudicators of natural knowledge through everyday encounters with practical manuscripts and printed books. She is beginning research on a second project that explores how Europeans imagined how they could read the human body in the transformational period between 1450 and 1650, when the Reformation, the introduction of Thessalian anatomy, and first contact with the New World presented a challenge to older models of the body based in medieval religion and medieval medical practice. In addition to her current book and her next book project, Dr. Reynolds is author of several scholarly articles in leading journals, including the Surgeria of Nicholas Nisbet, Writing Medical Authority in Later Medieval England, which appears in the journal Social History of Medicine, and which received the 2023 J. Worth Estes Prize of the American Association for the History of Medicine. So today, Dr. Reynolds joins us to discuss aspects of her current research involving books of medical knowledge created around the turn of the 15th century by ordinary English people, merchants, village priests, and well-to-do farmers, among others. Hundreds of the manuscripts they filled with medical recipes, herbals, and prognostications survive in archives across Britain and in the United States. And 3 of these are here at the National Library of Medicine. So it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome Dr. Reynolds, who joins us today for her presentation, Reading Remedy Books, Manuscripts and the Making of a National Medical Tradition. Dr. Reynolds, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today and for your preparation for what will be a wonderful talk, I'm sure. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to join such a wonderful group of scholars sharing their research as part of this wonderful series. So today's talk is actually going to provide a little bit of an overview of my first book that Jeff mentioned that will be forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press next fall. And specifically, I'll share a portion of my research into those 15th century Middle English medical manuscripts, including 2 in the NLM collections. Then I'll give a brief look at the landscape of early medical printing in England before finally sharing a portion of the book's final chapter, which follows 15th century medical manuscripts into the hands of 16th century collectors who, I argue, found in older English manuscripts evidence for the invention of a national medical tradition. But before I begin the talk, I want to pass on information about a website I created to host and share the data on 15th century manuscripts and 16th century books that I will be discussing in my talk today, and which form the core evidentiary material for my book. In total, I've compiled codicological data on 182 Middle English medical manuscripts and nearly 500 editions of early printed books containing vernacular knowledge related to medicine, agriculture, animal husbandry, astrology, and craft instruction, broadly construed. So as I said, I used this data as the core evidence for my book, but I really wanted to make it available to readers of the book. So I'm hosting that data as digital appendices here, where you can actually download CSV files of this data. I'm showing you here just a screen recording of what you'll find if you visit the site. So while I'll spend a lot of this talk describing specific manuscripts and printed books as examples, you should feel free to visit the site and get a sense of the breadth of the corpus I'm working with. And I'd also love feedback on the web design, which was my pet project this summer, so please don't hesitate to get in touch about that. So now you know where you can go and learn more about the manuscripts and printed books I'll discuss in this talk, and many more that I won't discuss. So let me get back to the matter at hand and begin with a little overview about my research into 15th century medical manuscripts before we dive in and look at a few examples together. So I'll start with some background about the origins of my book. It began, as most first books do, as a dissertation that investigated how access to books and the written word changed the way ordinary pre-modern English people thought of their relationship to knowledge. I was interested in this question because for much of the Middle Ages, non-elite lay people wouldn't have dreamed of owning a book. The average English parishioner might only ever get the chance to see a manuscript at Mass, and for this reason, many in medieval Europe had a reverence for books as sacred objects. Not only did they preserve the Word of God, they also preserved a legacy of learning, stretching all the way back to the ancients. But around the turn of the 15th century in England, this attitude toward books began to shift, owing to three interconnected developments within English culture. So first, and perhaps most importantly, was the wave of vernacular translation that began around the turn of the 15th century, really about the last quarter of the 14th century in England, when all of a sudden texts that had only circulated in Latin were available in Middle English. Second, literacy rates were on the rise in this period, such that many urban artisans and merchants, landowning country farmers, and even a very few well-to-do gentlewomen could read and write in English. And finally, manuscripts themselves got less expensive, thanks to the introduction of paper as a writing material and the adoption of faster cursive scripts. All of these developments made it feasible for non-elite members of the English laity to conceive of owning a book for utilitarian rather than sacred purposes. And when they were given the chance to own a book that they might use in their day-to-day lives, many of them chose to fill those books with medical knowledge. Hundreds of these vernacular remedy collections survive from 15th century England. And as I examined more than 200 of them in libraries across the US and the UK, I realized that they were telling an important story about how books transformed ordinary lay people's attitudes toward knowledge, toward their bodies, and toward the wider natural world. Now, I should say that scholars of Middle English have been working with these sources for years, and it is really thanks to their work, and specifically the database of scientific and medical writings in Old and Middle English compiled by Linda Urson-Boytz and Patricia Deary-Kurtz, that I was able to identify and see so many of these manuscripts. But my interest in these books was slightly different than that of the literary scholars whose work I relied on and who have identified and edited numerous Middle English medical texts. So namely, I was less concerned to trace the circulation of specific texts and far more concerned to understand how these books were used by the readers who commissioned or created them in 15th century England. And that isn't always easy to ascertain, as we'll discuss in this talk, particularly because reader marks and annotations are often scarce from early 15th century readers. So that meant I had to learn to read the manuscripts themselves for evidence of use, paying attention to their format as much as their contents. So let's look at an early example of one of these manuscripts, British Library MS Additional 34210, created around the turn of the 15th century, and we can get a sense for how a manuscript's format can tell us a little something about its use. So by the time this manuscript was created, Some of the wealthiest members of the English laity were already book owners. Religious manuscripts were by far the most popular genre of book in medieval England, and we can be sure that many members of the nobility owned books of hours or psalters to guide them through their prayers. And in many ways, these devotional guides influenced the format of the earliest vernacular remedy books, like the one you see here. So, like a book of hours or a psalter, this is a beautiful manuscript. It's written on parchment with a good deal of ornamentation. I hope you can see that the opening capital M there on the left is written in blue with red pen and ink filigree in the margins. And the rest of this page's contents are written in a very neat Gothic script, the kind often used in religious manuscripts. But of course, this manuscript isn't filled with prayers. It's filled with what we might think of as mundane medical information, a selection of Middle English medical recipes organized by ailment, beginning with the head and moving down through the body to the feet, and a short treatise on the virtues of herbs. And as hopefully you can see in this image, it also features a great deal of reader marginalia, much of it added more than a century after this manuscript's production. And that's a feature of these manuscripts that we'll return to later in this talk. So now let's look at another of these manuscripts, this one in the National Library of Medicine's collection, created probably between 1425 and 1450. This manuscript reflects some of the changes to manuscript making I mentioned earlier. Its folios are made of paper rather than parchment, and its texts are written in a cursive hand rather than the boxy Gothic script of the previous manuscript. Finally, though it does feature some red headings and some paraph marks that you can see, it's clearly not as decorated as the first example I showed. So why does this matter? Well, for one, these changes in format and material composition tell us that this manuscript was less expensive to own than the example I just showed from the British Library. And this means that it was more accessible to English readers beyond the most elite. And second, it tells us that readers' expectations about what a book should be were changing. Whereas the style and format of the British Library manuscript looks a bit more utilitarian, although this one is still quite formal in its composition, this NLM manuscript is a little bit more workaday than the one I showed a moment ago. And it also contains medical texts. It's got an herbal glossary, a treatise on the plague, 2 treatises on uroscopy, which was the practice of diagnosing a patient's illness according to the color of his or her urine, as well as a number of Middle English medical recipes added by different 15th century hands. And that too is typical of the genre. These were living books that were amended and edited to suit the needs of later readers. So here are 2 more pages from the same manuscript in the National Library of Medicine collection, where you can see these additional readers adding more information to the book. That red box you see on the left is showing you where the handwriting in this manuscript shifts just slightly at the bottom of folio 60R, just after the end of one of those 2 uroscopy treatises I mentioned. So for the next 20 or so folios of the manuscript, this slightly sloppier writing continues, suggesting that this reader, whoever he or she was, used blank space at the bottom of this page and remaining blank folios in the manuscript to amend the existing collection with still more medical knowledge. So in the right-hand image you're seeing here, you're seeing medical recipes added by this reader in a style much less formal than the earlier pages we saw. So here, recipe headings are simply underlined in black ink rather than marked with red. And I'd venture that this page maybe looks a bit more like the pages of a notebook you might own even today, filled with notes jotted one after the other. These recipes aren't organized in the head-to-foot manner of the British Library manuscript either. This single page features a recipe for colic, a recipe to make a candle wick burn so that no water can put it out, a recipe to remove a thorn, and one to remove warts. So it's really kind of a grab bag of information. The same could be said of the other 15th century medical manuscript in the NLM's collections that I'm going to talk about, MSE 30. This one probably created in the second half of the 15th century. So here you see 2 pages from the manuscript in 2 different styles. The page to the left at the start of the manuscript features medical recipes written in a neat but not especially formal style. And to the right is a page from slightly later in the manuscript, this one filled with various recipes, probably written by a single 15th century writer at several different times. So on this page, this writer recorded recipes for toothache, recipes to encourage menstruation, to cure hemorrhoids, and to stop a nosebleed. And that latter recipe involves the inscription of letters onto parchment, and then you bind it to the nose. So I hope you can see from this very brief tour of these two Middle English remedy books in the NLM collections, how the format of a manuscript can in fact tell us something about its use. We can see how and where recipes were added over time. We can take note of which ailments appear in those recipes. And we can even occasionally find evidence to help us identify the readers and writers themselves. For example, in MSE4, the first of the two manuscripts in the NLM collection that I showed, we find the name John Bariff on folio 16R and again on folio 20R. And then later in the manuscript, where the handwriting gets a little sloppier and the recipe is a little less organized, we find the name John Shorn, who may have been the scribe responsible for copying this entire section. But though we have these names, in neither case can we say for certain who these men were, where they lived, or what they did with these manuscripts. And that is a frustration that has very much haunted my research into these manuscripts from the very beginning. But because these collections were bespoke, because they were curated to the needs and wants of the individuals who owned them, it is possible, I argue, to reconstruct how English people's relationship to books and the knowledge they contained within them changed over time, especially if you looked at hundreds of these manuscripts, noting every instance of a reader mark or a change in handwriting, while also noting which sorts of recipes, prognostications, herbal texts, urinaries, anatomies, surgical instructions, craft directions, and charms appear in every single one. And here again, let me just plug the website where you can find all of this information that I've recorded in databases that you can work with. And then, of course, sometimes you get lucky and you can actually say something more concrete about manuscript users. And that is the case with these two medical manuscripts that I'm showing that are held in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. So the manuscript on the left, created around 1450, was written on paper by a Yorkshire medical man, Nicholas Nesbitt. I wrote about him in that article that was mentioned in the introduction. And Nesbitt left all sorts of information about his healing practices, techniques, and tips of the trade in commentaries he added to popular surgical recipes in his collection. The manuscript to the right was written around 1490, also on paper, by a London surgeon, William Adderston, who also made sure to note his experience using several recipes in this collection to heal various important people, like, for example, the mayor of Bristol. So both of these men use their manuscripts as sites for the cultivation of their own medical expertise. Neither were simply recording information that had come to them from other sources, though they certainly did that to some extent. They also use these manuscripts to create a record of their experience for future readers. And if we just glance at the manuscript on the right, created around 1490, I think it's easy to see that William Adderston, who made this collection, had a very different set of expectations about the function and format of a book than the anonymous owner of the first manuscript I showed, created around 1400. Both of these are Middle English remedy books, and they contain similar medical information. And yet, changes to the format of these manuscripts over the course of the 15th century speaks to parallel transformations in readers' attitudes toward medical knowledge. And that shift in attitude is one of the major transformations I try to capture in my book. So even though most of the medical knowledge collected in these manuscripts originated in Latin collections that had been translated into Middle English, over time, readers and writers like Nicholas Nesbitt and William Adderston felt comfortable adapting and amending these texts drawn from learned tradition so that they suited their own particular needs or reflected their own special expertise. I argue in my book that their ability to do so, indeed their recognition that such a thing was important, had everything to do with how they saw books as tools within their lives. Manuscripts were no longer sacred objects. They were sites through which medical practitioners like Nesbitt or Adderston could cultivate new ideas or practices generated through engagement with knowledge that was often very, very old. And then, in 1476, after nearly a century in which vernacular medical knowledge had circulated in manuscript, the printing press arrived on English shores, and readers' ideas about what a book was and how it might be used in their lives changed again. The first English printer to devote himself to publishing vernacular medicine was Richard Banks. In 1525 and 1526, he published a suite of medical texts, an herbal, a medical recipe collection, and a uroscopy treatise. The volume that you see here from Cambridge University Library contains all three of Banks's editions bound together, which is exactly as Banks had intended. What I love about this volume is that it shows how a printed book of vernacular medicine could be put to use. So in the photo on the right, you probably can't make it out, but the notes jotted just above the printer's mark there are explaining that the Latin phrase manus impleta means handful in English. So we can assume that this reader was making notes to himself about how to interpret other recipes written in Latin. So he'd remember what the measurement was, handful, manus impleta. And then this same reader added little leather tabs to the pages of this volume, presumably so that he could turn more quickly to sections that he prized especially. And I'm showing two of those little leather tabs on two different sections of the book here. So in many ways, it's clear from the reader additions to this volume that printed practical books served a similar function in the lives of 16th century readers as medical manuscripts had in the lives of 15th century readers. And this is for very good reason, because the medical knowledge in Banks's published editions here, these three published editions, were all drawn directly from Middle English manuscript sources. So I'm showing you just a couple of comparisons here between Banks's medical recipe collection and a 15th century manuscript you've already seen in this talk. So this is just to show how directly his contents were drawn from manuscript sources. So here's a recipe for headache. It opens the very first manuscript I discussed in this talk. And there's the same recipe opening the section for headache in Banks's 1526 medical publication. So this one in both manuscript and print says, take lye of vervain or betony or of wormwood or of chamomile, and therewith wash the head thrice in the week. And here's another comparison. This is a recipe for determining whether or not a patient's skull is fractured. And on the right, you're seeing the manuscript composed by Nicholas Nesbit in the mid-15th century that I mentioned earlier. Again, the two recipes are close to identical. It says, if the flesh be whole above the wound, take and shave the head there where the sore is, and double a linen cloth, and spread on it the white of an egg, and bind it for a night. And on the morrow, take it slyly away, and look if the clout, meaning the wound, be moist or dry. For if it be moist, the pan, the skull, is broken. And in the same place, carve the flesh and let the blood out, and anoint it with an ointment made therefore, and thus shall thou save him, or else he is but dead. So I'll spare you the comparisons between Banks's other two published medical editions, but let me just say that the contents of his herbal and urinary are likewise drawn directly from 15th century Middle English sources. And this is a little ironic only because the titles that Banks gave his herbal and his remedy collection advertised them as new. So you can see the titles of these medical editions here. Here beginneth a new matter, the which showeth and treateth of the virtues and properties of herbs. And here beginneth a new book of medicines entitled or called the Treasure of Poor Men. Now, the reason Banks made sure to advertise these two books as new was because he wanted to be able to claim royal privilege for his editions. Royal privilege was essentially a patent granted by the king to a printer for an exclusive right to print a text for a period of around 2 to 7 years. But to claim royal privilege, the text in question had to be both new and exclusive to one press. So in other words, you couldn't take an edition that was already popular on the market and then try to make it yours exclusively by claiming privilege. So Banks very prominently made claims to novelty on the title pages of these editions, despite the fact that we know their contents were anything but. However, what was new in these books were the organizational apparatus he used. Banks clearly had access to multiple manuscript sources, so the recipes I showed are not from the same Middle English collection. He clearly was referencing several different manuscripts, and he was able to collate their contents and then organize them into editions that were more accessible and more comprehensive than anything available in manuscript. The tactics he used here, collating and organizing manuscript knowledge, were adopted by most of England's early printers. So most of the earliest printed medical books in English were adaptations of texts that had circulated in manuscript, and that was because printers could feel confident that these texts would sell. This mattered, of course, because printers had to front all the costs of producing a run of perhaps as many as 500 books up front. You couldn't recuperate any of the costs of ink or paper or labor until every last book had been printed. So you wanted to be sure that a text would sell. The problem, of course, is that repackaging the same old text as new over and over again left English printers with a relatively finite corpus of material to work with. You're actually seeing a representation of that finite corpus here. This is a network analysis I created using the open access software Cytoscape. And here I'll put in another plug for the website where you can actually play around with a similar network analysis and move its nodes around to see how printers were connected through their publication of the same texts. So this network visualization is showing all editions of vernacular medicine printed in England before 1550. However, though there were 113 editions of vernacular medicine printed in England, you only see 34 titles here, because those 113 editions represent just 34 unique texts. So in this analysis, the titles of the texts are in white and the names of printers are in blue. And both the printers' names and the titles of the books are sized relative to their frequency in the network. So in other words, the larger the font, the greater the number of editions. So for example, you can see that Banks's remedy collection, The Treasure of Poor Men, and his Herbal, a book of the properties of herbs, the which is called an herbal, were central to the economy of medical knowledge in 16th century England because they are bigger than other titles in the graph, in the analysis. However, Richard Banks's name is small because he only printed 5 editions of medical books in his entire career. So what does this network analysis tell us exactly? Well, for one, we can see that printers had absolutely no problem reissuing editions of their rivals' work, like Banks's Herbal. That means that multiple printers were competing with one another with editions of the same medical text. And it didn't take long for many of them to realize that in order to attract new readers, they would need to market these same old texts in new ways. And the printer to master that technique, far better than anyone else, was Robert Wyer, whose name is larger than that of any other printer in this network because he was the most prolific publisher of medical books in the middle decades of the 16th century. Just like Banks, he took older texts that had been popular in manuscript and he updated them just slightly so that he could market them as new or newly translated. And he did this numerous times with Richard Banks's Herbal, which he marketed with increasingly hyperbolic titles throughout the 1550s, eventually producing an edition that claimed that it had been practiced by Dr. Linacro, which was a reference to Thomas Linacre, the royal physician and founder of the College of Physicians in 1518. So why does this matter to a history of medicine? Why should we care that English printers were repackaging the same old texts for sale to ordinary readers? Well, one of the major arguments of my book is that these marketing tactics changed how readers valued the contents of medical books. Because they were told over and over again to value books that had an element of novelty to them, they became comfortable selecting books from the bookshop that made such claims. And because there was so little regulation in the early print trade and so many competing editions of the same texts, readers really did have to use their judgment to decide which edition to buy. And over time, I argue, they learned to embrace novelty, originality, and experience as the criteria by which they should judge a book of medical knowledge. And this preference for novel or experiential knowledge paid dividends when, in the latter half of the 16th century, truly revolutionary medical knowledge did appear in vernacular printed books. When, for example, in 1580, John Frampton published his translation of Nicholas Menardus's treatise on New World Pharmacology for English readers, they were ready to embrace knowledge that was wholly new. Or, at least, most of them were. And more on that in just a minute. But as I will argue for the remainder of this talk, drawn from the last chapter of my book, all of this emphasis on novelty and originality in printed medical books encouraged in many early modern readers a nostalgia for what they perceived to be older, traditional knowledge in manuscripts. So even though we know that most printed medical books contain text drawn directly from Middle English manuscript sources, early modern readers wouldn't have known that. given how often these same books made claims to novelty and discovery. And so many 16th century readers returned to 15th century medical manuscripts precisely because they believed them to contain knowledge that was unavailable in print. So we have already seen some evidence of this early modern interest in medieval manuscripts in the first remedy book I discussed in this talk. This is British Library MS Additional 34210, and it contains numerous later 16th century reader marks, including those you can see on folio 5R at the left. And these are actually glossing Middle English spellings of various medical ingredients to update the spellings with more modern ones. So it's clear that this early modern reader was trying to update an old book to bring it in line with contemporary standards so that it would be more useful. But at the same time, we can see this reader taking pains to totally obliterate a charm that would have been said over a laboring woman in the page of the manuscript I've got pictured on the right. So even though the early 15th century scribe of this manuscript had seen no problem including this charm, by the later 16th century, following the English Reformation, that was of serious concern. And I highlight this erasure mark, and it's just one of several examples, several instances of early modern censorship in medieval remedy books, all of them, again, available on the website, because these are illustrative of broader transformations in English society. Both the coming of the press and the English Reformation together combined to alter early modern readers' attitudes toward the knowledge they found in centuries-old manuscripts. So I've already discussed the ways that the commodified knowledge economy created by commercial printing shaped early modern interest in older manuscript sources. But I want to take a moment here to say just a few words about how the English Reformation and its role in fostering the emergence of an antiquarian spirit among English readers shaped these choices. So first of all, the English Reformation, precipitated by Henry VIII's insistence on breaking with papal authority in 1534, not only imposed a new religious doctrine on the English people, it also made early modern readers newly aware of a distinction between past and present, old knowledge and new. By dissolving medieval institutions like monasteries, reforming the liturgy of worship, and reordering the cycle of the church year, the Reformation severed the patterns of the present day from the traditions of the past. And now that may seem like an obvious point, but for centuries, medieval intellectual and religious culture had emphasized continuity with ancient authorities or church fathers. So for Elizabethan parishioners, recognizing the past as past came as a real change. But while the Church of England may have broken with the traditions of medieval religion, it still needed to assert its historical foundation. Its argument, in a nutshell, was that the Catholic Church had been corrupted by centuries of medieval popes. So in fact, by bucking the authority of Rome, the Church of England was supposedly reviving the true church of antiquity. You can almost think of this as the original history wars. Both Protestants and Catholics alike each claimed that history would prove the righteousness of their cause. And because history was so important to constructing the authority of the Church of England, locating the early documents of the English Church became a very important project of Elizabethan ministers. Famously, Matthew Parker, Elizabeth's Archbishop of Canterbury, scoured the country for important religious manuscripts that had been scattered by the dissolution of the monasteries, eventually compiling an extraordinary collection of early medieval manuscripts now housed at the Parker Library in Cambridge. But from this inner sanctum of the Elizabethan court, interest in old books spread to men like the historian John Stowe or the Queen's astrologer and alchemist John Dee. By 1586, Dee and Stowe, together with the historian William Camden, were meeting regularly as founding members of the Society of Antiquaries. Now, none of this is news to historians. In fact, the emergence of a proto-nationalist antiquarianism in Elizabethan England is well known. But it is not a story that has yet been associated with amateur collectors of run-of-the-mill vernacular medical manuscripts. In fact, however, I would argue that the same spirit that drove Parker, Stowe, Dee, and Camden to collect treasures of Old English literature or theology also inspired anonymous collectors like Thomas Butts, who compiled this remedy book in 1564, which with medicines he gathered out of, quote, diverse Old English books. So at the time, Butts was one of just a very few individuals in England who had been to North America. However, he showed absolutely no interest in New World materia medica. Instead, he gushed in his table of contents, in a passage you see pictured here, that he had included remedies he found in, quote, diverse old English books because, quote, they be all such as the worst is too good to be left unwritten. Thomas Butts was the son of one of Henry VIII's court physicians, Sir William Butts, and presumably he had access to a wealth of medical knowledge. But it was diverse old English books, by which he almost certainly meant Middle English manuscripts, that captured his imagination. And he was not alone in this view. Though we don't know which diverse old English books Butts consulted, we can reconstruct the extent to which early modern English readers valued 15th century manuscripts in the hundreds of marginal notes and additions they left in those pages. Indeed, of the 182 15th century manuscripts in my corpus, 112 contain reader marks that can be dated to the 16th or 17th centuries. So I've got 3 examples of these reader marks here. At left, a reader adding a recipe quote for my Aunt Skinner in November 1563 within a very early 15th century medical manuscript. Another reader at center making a note of a birth, quote, the 5th of September in the morning in 1552. In another very early 15th century manuscript, but this one containing prognostications. And finally, on the far right, another notation in a mid-15th century manuscript, this one following a Middle English translation of Johannes Platiarius's Practica Brevis, from the London draper William Thorogood, noting that his daughter Anne was born on August 6, 1561, the same year that Paul's steeple was on fire. And he actually notes the time, presumably to be able to compose a horoscope from the moment of her birth. So these notes suggest that each of these early modern readers continued to value the natural knowledge they found in century-old recipe books. Perhaps they felt like the well-known physician astrologer Simon Forman, who added a note on the front flyleaf of a beautiful early 15th century Middle English copy of Lanfranc of Milan's Chirurgia Magna that, quote, this book is worth 10 pounds for the excellence of the remedies therein contained. Now, 10 pounds was a princely sum in Elizabethan England, but for Forman, Middle English remedies were worth their weight in gold. Of course, none of these readers had the language skills or the considerable learning of men like Archbishop Matthew Parker or royal physician Thomas Linacre, both of whom had reputations as humanist scholars in 16th century England, and both of whom found in very old manuscript sources the foundations of a truer history for the English church in Parker's case, or a truer account of medical theory in Linacre's case. But even though they lacked a humanist intellectual pedigree, the middling Englishmen who left notes in medieval remedy books, practicing physicians or well-to-do merchants, saw in Middle English manuscripts the chance to collect old knowledge from an English past that they believed had been lost owing to the over-commercialization of knowledge in print. They felt this way because years of marketing tactics from English printers had convinced them that what was for sale at the bookshop was new, even though nothing could be further from the truth. In their collections of Middle English medical manuscripts, they became what I call vernacular humanists or amateur antiquarians. And perhaps the most dedicated of these later 16th amateur antiquarians was Henry Dingley, a country gentleman whose star was on the rise in Marian and Elizabethan England. From at least 1547 to 1573, or perhaps up to his death in 1598, Henry Dingley amassed a collection of at least 5 Middle English medical manuscripts. And fortunately, we can reconstruct the timeline of his collecting because Dingley thought to date many of the marginal notations he made in these manuscripts, as you can see here. So on the left is the earliest dated reader mark from 1547, following a recipe he added to this collection for the migraine. In the center is a marginal note from 1560, and at right is the latest dated reader mark in any of his manuscripts, and this one is a note about the date of Easter in 1573. Like Thomas Butts, who copied recipes from diverse Old English books into a new recipe collection, in 1564, Dingley took what he found in the many medieval manuscripts he collected and began to organize it into a new collection. That manuscript, Welcome MS 244, contains a note indicating that, quote, wheresoever ye see this character HD stand in the margin of this my book against any medicine, oil, ointment, salve, plaster, treat, powder, syrup, electuary, unguent, water, or any other thing contained within this book, that have I, Henry Dinley, proved without doubt, and no other have I myself proved. The margins of his medieval manuscripts are dotted with these HD marks, indicating recipes he tried and tested. From diverse Old English books, Dingley created a new resource from which he and his heirs could develop their skills as healers. And indeed, it was Dingley's son and grandson who completed Welcome MS 244, filling its nearly 300 folios with recipes, some of which they noted, quote, did help my father, suggesting that they looked for his HD as markers of excellence. The collections of Middle English manuscripts and the compositions of new remedy collections, like this one by Dingley or the manuscript we saw earlier by Thomas Butts, show us that Elizabethan readers were attuned to the value of manuscripts they perceived to be very old sources of knowledge. But let us not forget that in Elizabethan England, this interest in the sources of the past carried an ideological and political weight. These men lived in a society that had been shaped by the Reformation and by publications like John Fox's Acts and Monuments, published in English for the first time in 1563. Fox's enormous work of church history drew from a number of manuscripts collected by Matthew Parker and his circle. But instead of publishing these sources as standalone translations or transcriptions, as Parker did, he presented these sources in a narrative history that made the distant past directly relevant to Fox's present. Like other Protestant church historians, Fox argued that the early church was the, quote, true church, and that everything that came after the expansion of the medieval papacy was degradation and corruption. The English Reformation, which had purged the church of the false doctrine of popery, was not so much a break with the past as a return to it. To prove it to his readers, Fox published transcriptions of medieval letters and other documents within the Acts and Monuments, many of them reproduced in their original Latin and an English translation. Now, Fox's book, hugely expensive though it certainly was, seems to have made quite an impression on the Elizabethan collectors we've met in this talk. Henry Dingley was so inspired by Fox's account of the Marian martyr Robert Smith that he copied an excerpt of a poem attributed to Smith in Fox's book, A Father's Exhortation for His Children, in one of his 15th century medical manuscripts. And Thomas Butts, the 16th century compiler, the one who prized diverse Old English books, not only owned a copy of Fox's great martyrology, he actually kept a picture of the author hanging in his parlor. Nor were Dingley and Butts the only Elizabethan medical men to admire Fox's work of documentary church history. The physician Timothy Bright, who matriculated with his MD from Cambridge in 1579, published an abridged version of Fox's history because, as he wrote in the preface to the book, quote, "In mine opinion, there is not a book under the scriptures more necessary for a Christian to be conversant in." Indeed, to a greater extent than almost any other publication that emerged from the wave of antiquarian collecting in the early Elizabethan era, Fox's martyrology played an important role in demonstrating to 16th century readers like Dingley, Butts, and Bright that older sources of knowledge were valuable correctives to present-day misapprehensions about the state of the world. But even more than that, Fox's attention to the material evidence of the past facilitated what Alexandra Walsham has described as the emergence of a, quote, Protestant consciousness in England, anchored by a belief in divine providence, or the idea that God's hand could be seen at work in the world, shaping events in the past to reflect his divine will. Indeed, Walsham has described the doctrine of providence working on two complementary planes in early modern English thought. Quote, "History was the canvas on which the Lord etched his purposes and intentions, nature a textbook and a laboratory in which he taught, demonstrated, and tested his providence." In Fox's Acts and Monuments, divine providence was made legible in the documents of history. But for those who read medieval remedy books filled with medical recipes and herbals like Dingley, Butts, and presumably Timothy Bright, God's providence was equally legible in nature. Indeed, this was the very premise undergirding the herbals and medical remedies in the 15th century manuscripts we viewed in this talk. This prayer, copied in the midst of a remedy collection in Cambridge University Library, summarizes this view quite nicely. "God, you who created and marvelously formed mankind, and you who gave medicine for restoring the health of the human body, Give your blessing over this antidote so it may intervene in certain bodies and so that they may merit recovery of health. This prayer references that foundational premise of medieval medicine, that God had endowed all of his creation in the natural world with virtues, which could be harnessed in the preparations of medicines to heal the human body of whatever ailed it. Now, these virtues were not always tangible or sensible, and so medical recipes and herbal treatises were necessary guides to the comprehension of God's providence in nature. Each remedy or herbal text was a means of witnessing and experiencing God's power at work in the natural world. But let us not forget that in post-Reformation England, the search for evidence of God's hand at work in the world, whether in historical documents or in medicines prepared from plants and herbs, was bound up with the Elizabethan project to articulate how divine providence was working, especially for the English, whose church stood against the Catholic powers in Spain and France. This was, after all, exactly the reasoning behind Fox's Acts and Monuments, which used historical documents to show that God had always had a special plan for the English church. And so we should not be surprised that the same man who abridged Fox's massive book for a popular audience, the physician Timothy Bright, capitalized on his medical expertise to argue that nature would prove that God had a special plan for the English too. In 1580, Bright authored a treatise wherein is declared the sufficiency of English medicines for cure of all diseases cured with medicine. Though Bright never mentions it by name, his treatise was likely a response to John Frampton's translation of Nicholas Menardus's Manual on the Pharmacology of the New World I mentioned earlier. It was published in the very same year. Menardus, who had been a practicing physician in Seville for decades, as well as an exporter of New World medicines, had written the 3-volume manual as an advertisement for the marvelous curative properties of tobacco, sassafras, and other New World plants, specifically because he hoped his manual would encourage trade in these materials, which he was very eager to profit from. But Timothy Bright was having none of that. He wrote his treatise in order to, quote, kindle in us a greater diligence to inquire after the medicines of our own country yield, and more care to put them in practice, as England aboundeth plentifully with all things necessary for thy maintenance of life and preservation of health. Bright's reasoning was simple. God in his divine providence would not have allowed the English to remain deficient in foreign medicines like tobacco or guaiacum for so long if they really were beneficial to English people. He argued that for the English, quote, home medicines of our country's yield of equity must necessarily perform the same to us which their medicines do to them. Else I would know why we should be inferior unto them, or one nation more privileged that way than another, the need being common and the providence of God all one. In other words, English medicines must be suited to English bodies because God had put them in England. Bright could not conceive of a world in which God would favor the Spanish Catholics, or worse, the heathen Native Americans, and leave the righteous English without. Nay, he wrote, which is yet more absurd, that the health of so many Christian nations should hang upon the courtesy of those heathens and barbarous nations to whom nothing is more odious than the very name of Christianity. But for Bright, living in post-Reformation Europe, where geopolitical boundaries had become markers of religious divides, making sense of the workings of divine providence in nature was more complicated than drawing a simple line between heathen and Christian. As Bright saw it, just as, quote, the Indian, Arabian, Spaniard have their Indish, Arabian, and Spanish medicines, so also the German hath his, the Frenchman his, and the Englishman his own proper, belonging to each of them. In Bright's view, medicine differed not just according to environmental or astral influences, as ancient and medieval theorists had believed, but rather according to what we might call national character, which in 1580 also meant religious identity. The confessional divisions that had fractured post-Reformation Europe made it possible to assert that God's providence recognized national borders. But Bright didn't just argue for the existence of a national medical tradition. He lived in Elizabethan London, where remedy collections and herbals crowded the shelves of print shops and booksellers. He knew he should also give English readers the means to test his claims. And so as the final act in his treatise, Bright suggested that his readers experiment with local medicines, since, as he wrote, quote, "The causes and effects of our bodies are of all arguments the most forcible to establish and overthrow anything to be decided by reason." And then he filled the final 10 pages of his book with recipes and instructions that readers could try in order to observe those causes and effects. Now, as remedy collections go, Bright's left much to be desired. As you can perhaps see here, none of his recipes were organized according to their main ingredient, as herbals had been organized since the time of Dioscorides, nor did his publisher employ any of the usual paratexts to aid a reader in discovering the right cure for a particular disease. There are no headings, no use of blank space to separate recipes, no index or table of contents. Despite his best intentions, Bright's remedies were less detailed than those available in other contemporary medical publications. Which may explain why, in 1615, when the publisher of Bright's treatise reissued the book, he appended a much better organized herbal text, which he described as, quote, "growing for the most part within our English clime." That really cracks me up. In this copy of the book, in the National Library of Medicine Special Collections, 5 sections have been added to the back of Bright's original treatise. The first in the format of a traditional alphabetized herbal of plants growing in European climates, and 4 shorter catalogs of English medicines pertaining to dropsy, kidney stones, epilepsy, and pestilence. Though Timothy Bright didn't compose a particularly useful remedy book himself, his publisher, Thomas Mann, clearly recognized that Bright's argument about English medicine and divine providence would have the greatest effect if it were presented in that format. After all, what could be better to prove to English readers that God's intention for the English people than with remedies perfectly suited to English bodies? Timothy Bright, editor of Fox's Acts and Monuments and author of a treatise defending English medicine, knew that history and nature were duly reflective of divine will. But so too did the early modern collectors of 15th century practical manuscripts we've met in this talk. These manuscripts filled with medical recipes and herbal instructions and a faintly archaic version of the language Elizabethans spoke were nature and history wrapped up neatly in a package that was wholly English in character, which at least partially explains why 16th century collectors like Thomas Butts valued them so highly. It certainly may account for why John Gerard, surgeon to the Queen, acquired British Library MS Sloane 7, an early 15th century manuscript with a short version of the same Middle English herbal Richard Banks published in 1525. To the back of that manuscript, Gerard added notes and organizing herbal ingredients alphabetically, as well as a signature and the date 1577. 20 years later, John Gerard would go on to author The Great Herbal, or General History of Plants, a work that would remain the definitive source for information on English flora for a century or more, especially after it was revised by Thomas Johnson in 1633. In giving English readers a comprehensive source for identifying and using the botanicals in their backyards, Gerard in some ways fulfilled the mission of Timothy Bright. And just like the many other 16th century readers we've encountered in this chapter, he left his mark in a nearly 200-year-old Middle English medical manuscript, perhaps because, like Timothy Bright, Henry Dingley, and Thomas Butts, he saw these sources as crucial to the making of an English medical tradition. Thanks so much.
Dr. Reynolds, thank you for a fantastic talk. That was really fascinating at so many levels. I received a number of questions from viewers, and I just want to remind viewers that if you do have a question for Dr. Reynolds, please use the live feedback button underneath the video. We do have time for a few questions, and I really look forward to asking them to you because they are great questions for a great presentation. So let's begin. Thank you for this fascinating look at early medical practice and traditions, exclamation point. Your website, here comes the question. Your website and the data you share there makes it clear that there's a strong data science aspect to your research, something that might seem counterintuitive for research centered in the 15th and 16th centuries. Did you find it challenging to compile your research into a format that could be investigated more deeply with data science tools? What was hard about it, and what aspects of your research really lent themselves to this type of data interrogation?
Wow, that's an excellent question. So you're right. I did, it's interesting. The data science aspect of this project really developed over the course of my research. I mean, research began for this project a decade ago, which is hard for me to believe now. And I sort of hinted at some of my reasons early on in the presentation. So I don't want to make any claims to sort of like discovering Middle English medical manuscripts, right? There have been scholars working on these texts for a very long time. They've done excellent work, particularly scholars of Middle English medicine and literary scholars. But I felt like, what was missing was a kind of aggregate view, because there are a kind of surprisingly large number of these manuscripts that survive. I mean, I think the sort of maybe popular idea would be that we'd have maybe one or two. I mean, there's hundreds. I don't even claim to have seen close to all of them, right? And what can be frustrating about them individually is that very often they are quite formulaic. So the same recipes kind of recirculate with maybe slightly different forms across a number of manuscripts, where you really want to see readers kind of making notes and showing a kind of personal reaction. You don't always find that. And the reasons for that are, historical and cultural. You didn't have that many people that could were comfortable writing in the early 15th century, all kinds of reasons for this. But what I realized is that if I wanted to tell a story about change over time, and I didn't have the number of sort of individual reactions that I wanted, I was going to need to find a way to aggregate this data. And so I was really incredibly fortunate that I began my research, my first visits to archives in the summer of 2013, I believe, 2014. And that was right about the time that photography policies changed at the British Library and the Bodleian Library, which I cannot overstate how much that made this project feasible. So I could take photos and then come back and process the data, basically, take really detailed notes on the contents of these manuscripts, take detailed notes about reader marks, and then slowly over years compile the data that you now see on this site. And of course, I had assistance in all of this work, from the amazing scholarship that came before me. I very much leaned on the work of literary scholars and manuscript specialists. And then the printed side, I mean, it's a different story because, again, scholars have done incredible work with early English print. The entire English short title catalog has been made available as a digital database from the British Library. But again, I felt like in order to work with this data, I'd have to find a way to harvest it. And I used actually Zotero as my sort of easy internet data scraping tool, cleaned all the data, and then was able to, I had to clean it in the sense that early modern titles are not the same, right? Lots of funny spellings. I had to standardize titles to get a kind of sense of how many of the same texts were printed over and over again. And then I do think it really did enable me to tell a big story about change over time in a way that, attention to individual, and I do have attention to individual examples in the book, but I feel like I balance the two because I don't think you can get that bigger picture without the data behind it. Again, thank you for the question. It's been something I've learned. It's also been a learning process for me, and it's been really enjoyable to learn these tools and these strategies as I've moved along.
Thank you very much. And in fact, another question we have is a logical extension of some of your remarks in your response to the first one. How did you become interested in pursuing a career in early modern European medicine and science? And can you say a few words about your training in both languages and reading handwriting? And I'm going to add to that. You already mentioned your perhaps self-training in Zotero, but these digital humanities tools. So can you unpack, how you came to this interest and what type of training did you have in languages and otherwise?
Sure. Another fantastic question. So I will admit to being a history nerd. I'll just right off the bat, my interest in the time period has a lot to do with I was kind of it was like a Tolkien nerd as a kid. And so I was always interested in medieval history, but specifically as I grew more serious in my scholarly interests, I just think there's something so fascinating about this 200-year period between, really like from the start of the 15th century to the close of the 16th into the 17th century. There's just such, in my opinion, a kind of rapid acceleration in terms of societal and cultural change over this period that I feel like there's just still so much more to be said, right? We know a lot about the kind of landmark discoveries of this period. Vesalius publishes De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1543. You've got Copernicus, you've got Harvey in the early 17th century. You've got these kind of really big revolutionary figures and this idea of the scientific revolution and the Reformation. And so because there are these huge structural changes to society, I felt like there was something there for me to try to access how kind of everyday people experienced it. That's always been my biggest interest, is like, we know how the most elite were doing it. We know how the guys who could write the Latin treatises are thinking, but how is everyone else sort of grappling with this seismic change? And so I felt the only way to get that answer would be to try to learn how to read the things that they could read. And paleography, which is the ability to read old handwriting, is the first step in that process. So language training and paleography are important. I was sort of self-taught in Middle English, because if you read enough of it and you read it out loud, you can start to hear it. I always teach students, if you read a line of Middle English out loud, you'll be able to hear what it is in modern English. Maybe you won't see it with your eyes, but you hear it. Latin took a lot longer, so I needed Latin, I needed French, and those were, years of language training in graduate school. And paleography as well. I was incredibly fortunate. My first year, I did my PhD at Rutgers, had a wonderful professor who was on my dissertation committee, Jim Michelli, who's an expert in English courthand, which is so hard. And he had a semester, like one-on-one independent study with myself and another one of his graduate students. And I joked with my family that he Mr. Miyagi'd us. If any of you have seen Karate Kid, like, it was so hard and we didn't know what we were doing. And then all of a sudden, by the end of the semester, we were like, oh my God, I think we can read a little bit of this impossible handwriting. And after doing Latin courthand, which again, if any of you are medievalists, I hope you're nodding along in the background. It's so hard. Coming back to Middle English cursive was not so bad. And it just took a lot of practice, right? And I had a lot of professors to remind me along the way that my first trip to the archives, when I opened a manuscript, I was going to cry because it was going to seem like I couldn't read it. And then if I just kept going back, I would. And they were right. And they had wonderful stories to share. And the digital humanities stuff was also just a curiosity. I was really fortunate to be involved in some digital humanities projects early on in my career. So I was a translator on the Making and Knowing project out of Columbia, run by Professor Pamela Smith. From an early point, I was on the translation side and on the sort of digital, sort of figuring out how to build this incredibly cool interactive transcription. So that it whetted my interest, and then I just kept learning. I kept, trying to go to whatever talks I could and ask the right questions and be creative and curious and there's still lots more to learn, though. There's still lots more.
Well, you've quite obviously, evidently accomplished so much, and while there's a lot to learn, you've mastered so much. It's very evident. Congratulations.
Thank you. Very kind.
Of course, well deserved. I'm smiling when you talk about paleography. As someone who's originally trained in modern European history and modern British history, I struggled with reading 18th and 19th century handwriting, and my colleagues who studied medieval history were you need to take a paleography class? What, are you kidding me? They had a good laugh about that. I'm like, well, this is hard, So anyway, enough. So no, thank you very much. It was very exciting, and the obvious. It is obvious how much you love your subject, and it's really infectious, and it's wonderful. Can you speak to the subjects? And you did this a little bit in your talk, but I want to ask this question anyway. Can you speak to the subjects of gender and likely also education with respect to the writings that you've studied? How many were written by women, if you can determine that, in what regions and on what subjects?
Sure, this is a great question. And I will admit that when I feel like so many, my minor is, I'm a women's and gender historian, and I approached this project hoping to find women, so many women. I was looking for them everywhere I could. That is not to say there are no women here. There are clearly examples of books that were created for women. So there's one example in my corpus of an early 15th century manuscript that has recipes for textile production. So, and a specific kind of textile production, silk braiding, that was only done by women. And I don't imagine that this manuscript would have been created for anyone except a woman. I don't know who that person is. It's a pretty lavish manuscript, so I assume this is an elite woman who's got this book in the early 15th century. By the later 15th century, there's more evidence of kind of household manuals of the kind that you find later. So Elaine Leong has done wonderful work on later 16th and 17th century recipe collections created by women all across, mostly elite women, middling to elite women all across England. So it's certainly something that increases as literacy rates rise. But the hard truth is that in the 15th century, there aren't that many women who are literate to be able to write their own manuscript collection, and few that were even literate enough to be able to read. What I do in one of the chapters of my book, though, I talk about, because I'm so interested in thinking about how knowledge that is associated with women is being circulated in these books, because there's a lot of information, medical knowledge in these collections about menstruation, lactation, birth. So I was interested in sort of paying attention to, once a lot of the contents of these manuscripts become available in print, what happens to the women's knowledge? Does it get reprinted in the same way as the other sort of generic medical recipes? So I have a chapter in the book that assesses this, and I find, not surprisingly, I guess, that no, what happens is women's knowledge gets sort of characterized as something different from masculine knowledge once it moves into a print economy where everyone is able to access these. Because certainly, there is a difference in terms of social and educational status between readers of the manuscripts and readers of 16th century printed books. Most of the books I look at really were quite expensive. So inexpensive. So I really do assume that a larger proportion of the population can afford these books. If you could read one of these books I'm looking at. And so once you see this knowledge become more diffuse and more available, there is a kind of construction of a kind of an alternate view for women's knowledge than men's knowledge. And it's not consistent, right? So like in one book, a charm might be characterized as like suspiciously feminine. And then in another popular book that supposedly comes from a learned philosopher, it's not problematic. And so that's what I'm trying to sort of tease out, like how do you repackage women's knowledge in different ways to sell books? But frustratingly, I mean, the sad answer is that, like, man, did I want to find so many women readers, and it's really hard to find them in the archives. But I've done my best, and there are a few instances I can point to. And then that increases, of course, over the 16th and 17th century. You get lots more women readers and writers, and well-known ones, right, that have been studied by historians and literary scholars.
Thank you. We have time for two more questions. The first is, this individual writes, "Thank you very much for this talk, very informative and very enlightening. My question is about the sharing and distribution of 15th century manuscripts." So this picks up on your previous remarks about the print economy circulation, obviously. Since someone like William Adderston, writing around 1490, would probably not have recognized that the relatively new printing presses could be used to convert manuscripts to books with numerous copies, what would have been their expectations of sharing their manuscripts? Adderston used his manuscript to tout his own experience and expertise, but would he then have expected to simply share his manuscript with colleagues to read, or would he expect people to handwrite their own copies of his work? If someone was copying someone else's medical manuscript, wouldn't they just skip the parts that were just the self-promotion of the author?
Oh, that's a really great question. Ironically, no, I don't think they didn't. I mean, there's a number of recipes in these manuscripts that record, like, this recipe was told by this master physician to this guy who claimed it healed this. I think it's part of, so let me go back to the beginning of the question. You're right. In 1490, at that point, there's been only like 2 medical books published in English, a plague treatise and a dietary. That's it. So you're right. Adderston probably wouldn't have had the idea that, all of a sudden print's going to completely transform how that kind of recipe knowledge is transformed. Is transmitted. He could have done either. Very often, I think these manuscript collections circulated among friends and family and neighbors. In many cases, you might borrow a book and just try a recipe, or you might take the opportunity to copy what recipes were useful when you have the book in your possession and then give it back. So there's been some really wonderful work on this sort of transmission by linguists of Middle English who are actually able to trace what are called discourse communities through these recipes. If you get a cluster of manuscripts that share certain linguistic similarities, we imagine that the recipes are actually, like, we can sort of reconstitute a regional kind of sharing of medical knowledge. So we know that's happening. We know that people are swapping books and sharing books and copying things that come to hand. And then you can also see it in the manuscripts themselves, right? So when a new page of recipes is added after the end of a treatise, and they come one after the other, I assume what they're doing is sitting there with a different copy text in hand, and they're just entering as much information as they can. And as I said, they do not seem averse to including what we would think of as self-promotion. I think I don't know if it's one of the biggest differences, because I don't even think it's that different between modern society and pre-modern society. Markers of authority were so important. Being able to say either that a recipe came from an authoritative textual source. So very often Middle English recipe collections will open with kind of, very spurious authorial attributions. Like, these were the best recipes of Hippocrates, Galen, and Socrates, right? Like, of course they're not. But what matters is that you have that authoritative imprimatur on the knowledge. So that works the same way. If it's like something that some guy said that he saw a physician cure the mayor of Bristol with this recipe, then that makes it more powerful. And I think that's why you also get the probatum est, which is just the Latin for proved. This is proved. You get those at the bottom of recipes all the time too, because it's saying someone has witnessed this work, and therefore there is a stamp of authority on it. And because authority matters so much, you would want to include that in your recipe collection, even though it might seem like self-promotion to us.
Understood. Thank you very much. So the final question today is going to require you to explain a term to us,
Sure.
to those who are watching. So are those adorable little hand-drawn alembics on the Richard Banks book? So it's alembics, A-L-E-M-B-I-C-S. Can you tell us what that is and what that means?
Sure, I can. If you want, I can even. I'm going to try to go back to show you exactly what that means. They
Sure.
look like alembic. They look like alembics to me, I will say. All right,
Okay.
I'm going to go to the picture. Okay, so what they're talking about is, I don't know if you can see my mouse here. It's these right here. They may be alembics. So alembics would be a glass vial used for distillation purposes and very common in alchemical distillation. They may also just be urine flasks. So I will say this is at the end of the urinary treatise, and uroscopy treatises in Middle English and Latin and other traditions have very often in manuscript these illustrations where they have a depiction of the flask of urine, and then the urine is colored, so that the idea is you observe the color of the urine, you diagnose the patients. So I think it could go either way. It's possible they're alembics. It is. I mean, it's a medical book. There are not a lot of recipes involving distillation in Banks's collection, in part because he's drawing from earlier medieval sources that are not super concerned with distillation. They may be urine flasks. It could be either, though. I'm inclined to say urine flasks, probably, if that helps, but I can't say for sure one way or the other.
Understood. Okay. Well, thank you, and thanks to the individual who wrote that question, who's obviously in near your field. Dr. Reynolds, thank you very much for preparing this talk, for coming to the NLM and so many other associated collections, for your fascinating research, and certainly also your passion for your subject and bringing to life the stories in these texts, and with all of their complexity and all of their beauty. And we wish you very well in your continued intellectual journey, much continued success on your next book project, and many more thereafter. So we'll keep in touch, and thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate your time and preparation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So before we conclude this afternoon, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in to Dr. Reynolds' talk today, and for tuning in to our history talks during the course of 2023. We really appreciate your interest. We appreciate you being in touch with us here at the National Library of Medicine with whatever your research interests are, historical and modern, in any capacity. And if my colleagues or I could be a resource for you in your work, please don't hesitate to reach out. And just a final note that we're going to be announcing our 2024 history talks early in the new year. So stay tuned, and please join us then, and be well in the meantime. Happy holidays to everybody, and thank you again for joining us today. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.